The winds of the north howled over the camp near the twins. Robb Stark stood by the fire, his eyes locked on the flames, unaware that this night was meant to be his last. His direwolf Grey Wind growled low beside him, uneasy and tense. Something was wrong. The Red Wedding was a trap, but what no one had expected was that one of the Frey daughters had secretly warned Catelyn Stark moments before the betrayal. The girl, Ellyra Frey, only 15, had grown up hearing stories of Ned Stark's honor and was sickened by her father's plan. She slipped a note to Catelyn in the feast hall. The old Lady Stark read it under the table and acted fast. Catelyn rose from her seat, heart pounding. She leaned over to whisper to Robb, who was laughing beside Talisa, unaware of the knives slowly closing in. "Now," Catelyn whispered, "get up. Something is wrong." Robb's eyes narrowed as he scanned the hall. The music shifted. The doors were closing, and the guards moved into new positions. The smile left his face. Grey Wind, still locked in his cage outside, let out a piercing howl. That was the final sign. Robb stood up and yelled, "To arms!" Chaos erupted. Arrows flew from the rafters. Robb ducked, pulling Talisa behind a table. His men, those still sober, grabbed swords and fought back. The Freys hadn't expected resistance, not this early. Their surprise failed. The Northerners rallied. Rose Bolton lunged at Robb, blade drawn, but Catelyn, burning with rage, stepped in his way. She stabbed him with a dagger she had hidden under her cloak. He fell, blood gushing from his neck. "For Ned!" she hissed. Robb had no time to grieve. He knew they couldn't win a long battle here. "Retreat, get to Grey Wind," he ordered. His most loyal bannermen formed a shield wall as he, Talisa, and Catelyn made their escape. Ellyra Frey led them through a servant passage where Grey Wind, finally freed by a sympathetic stable boy, met them, covered in blood and fury. The group escaped the castle, riding hard into the night. Behind them, the cries of dying men echoed. Through the trees, Robb's army was broken, but he was alive, and that meant hope. In the days that followed, the survivors regrouped in the Wolfswood. Only a few hundred remained, but they were enough. Robb knew he couldn't trust the old ways anymore. The North had bled for too long. The time for honor and oaths had passed. "I will not just be king in the North," he said to his council one cold morning. "I will be the one who burns down the old rules. A new dynasty must rise from this betrayal, one that no Lannister, Frey, or Bolton can ever touch." Catelyn, though broken by grief, supported her son. Talisa, strong despite her own wounds, stood beside him. And to everyone's surprise, Ellyra Frey swore herself to Robb, declaring her loyalty not to the Freys, but to the Starks. Word spread like wildfire. Robb Stark had survived. The Wolf King was not dead. The small folk began whispering tales of his escape. The Red Wedding became a cursed name, and many Northerners who had once doubted him returned to his side. House Manderly, House Umber, and even some disgraced Knights of the Vale sent men and ravens. But Robb knew survival was not enough. He had to strike back, and not just in the north. He turned to the one place no one would expect, the Riverlands. Walder Frey had betrayed Geste, one of the oldest laws of Westeros. If Robb could take back the Riverlands and punish the Freys, he could send a message to all 7 kingdoms. "We won't just survive this," he told his war council. "We'll build something stronger, a kingdom not born out of old bloodlines, but out of vengeance, unity, and strength." And so the plan began. Robb sent secret messages to the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, still hiding near Riverrun. He called on old allies and made new promises. The Riverlands were boiling, angry at the Freys' treachery. Robb just needed a spark. Ellyra Frey proved useful again. She knew the layout of the twins, the weaknesses, and the hatred festering within her family. She told Robb, "My brothers fear you. Strike soon, and they'll break." Robb kissed his wife goodbye and led a band of men south once again. They weren't marching just for revenge. They were marching to build a new dynasty, forged in betrayal, hardened by war, and led by a man who had seen death and refused to kneel. The road to River Run was muddy and soaked with old blood. The Riverlands had become a graveyard of broken banners. Every village bore scars, burned fields, butchered men, and frightened children. Robb Stark saw it all. His heart hardened with every mile. This wasn't just war anymore. It was justice. Robb had only a few hundred men with him, but they were loyal, tested by betrayal, and ready to die for him. They called themselves the Wolf Guard, a brotherhood born from the ashes of the Red Wedding. With them rode Ellyra Frey, her face hidden beneath a grey cloak. Her knowledge of the phrase would be their weapon. By the time they reached River Run, Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, was waiting atop the walls. His old eyes flared with fire when he saw Robb alive. "I thought you were dead," he said as he embraced his nephew. "They tried," Robb said coldly. "They failed." The Blackfish didn't ask questions. He saw what Robb had become. The boy who marched south was gone. In his place stood a cold, focused man, one who had escaped death and now carried the rage of the North with him. Together, they planned the fall of the twins, but Robb didn't just want to kill Walder Frey. That was too easy. He wanted the world to see what betrayal cost. So they laid traps, spread rumors, and leaked Robb's survival through whispers and frightened ravens. Fear crept into the halls of the twins. Some Freys fled, some sent secret letters, begging for mercy. It was Ellyra's turn. She returned to her home disguised as a fleeing daughter. Her father, old and arrogant, believed she'd run from the chaos. "The wolf is dead," he told her. "You are welcome home." Ellyra smiled sweetly and poisoned the wine. On the night of the Frey feast, nearly 24 Freys, including 3 of Walder's sons, fell dead before dessert. As panic spread, the Wolf Guard struck. They crossed the river in silence, using boats hidden by the Blackfish. The guards were drunk and disorganized. Grey wind led the charge, tearing through the halls like a demon. Robb himself stormed into the dining room, face to face with Walder Frey. The old man tried to run. He slipped in his own son's blood. "You invited me to your hall," Robb said, raising his sword. "Now dine with your ancestors." The blade fell. The North had its vengeance, but Robb didn't burn the twins. He took them. Instead of destruction, he planted his banner, a new sigil, the stark direwolf in silver wrapped in a crown of iron thorns. The North was not just reclaiming honor, it was rewriting the rules. The Freys were wiped out or forced to kneel. Ellyra Frey, now known as Ellyra Stark, was named Warden of the Crossing, adopted into House Stark. She had earned it in blood. This act sent ripples through the realm. The Lannisters in King's Landing called it rebellion. Robb called it rebirth. He summoned all surviving lords of the Riverlands and north to River Run. "The South betrayed us," he declared. "The crown is broken. The old kings play their games while we bury our dead. No more. From this day forward we are not subjects, we are sovereign." Then he dropped the final blow. "I will not take the title of king in the North," he said. "That is not enough." The hall went silent. "I will be High King of Westeros, not by blood, but by will, by right of survival. The 7 kingdoms are broken. Let them choose whom to follow. I will build something stronger, not out of gold or names, but out of justice." It sounded like madness to some, but the room erupted in roars. Robb wasn't just a king anymore. He was a symbol. A ghost returned to life, leading a rebellion against everything that had failed Westeros. Meanwhile, in Winterfell, the Starks were rising too. Bran, now crippled but wiser than his years, had begun having strange dreams, visions of a tree with red eyes and whispers in the dark. He sensed Robb was alive long before the letters arrived. Sansa, a prisoner turned pawn in the south, secretly sent word to Robb through a network of maids and broken knights. "King's Landing is weaker than it looks," she wrote. "The lion is bleeding. Arya, far away across the sea, heard whispers of the Wolf King and smiled for the first time in years. "He survived," she muttered. "Time to go home." Robb's dream was spreading like wildfire. He declared the new pact, an alliance of northern and riverland houses, bound not by forced loyalty, but by mutual justice. He promised no lord would be forced to kneel, only to stand together when the South came for them, and they would come. Word came that Tywin Lannister had called his bannermen. But his strength was faltering, enemies were circling, the Iron Throne was rusting. Robb didn't fear Tywin anymore. He feared something else. What would be left of Westeros when the lions, dragons, and shadows finally tore it apart? He looked at Talisa, now pregnant with his child. He touched her stomach and whispered, "You won't grow up under their rule. You'll be born into something new, something better." And so, with a stolen castle, a river of vengeance, and a kingdom of broken men, Robb Stark laid the foundation for something unthinkable, a new dynasty. But Westeros never forgets, and it never forgives. The North had crowned him once. Now the Riverlands hailed him as High King. But Robb Stark knew titles meant nothing if they weren't defended. The flames of his rise lit up the kingdoms, and in the shadows, enemies began to gather. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister stared at the Raven's message with trembling fingers. "Robb Stark has taken the twins. Walder Frey is dead. The Riverlands are rising." She read it again, and again. Her face twisted into something bitter. "He should be dead," she whispered, her voice cold as winter. They swore he was dead. Tommen sat quietly on the Iron Throne, too young to understand the depth of what was coming. The court had grown quiet. The gold cloaks were fewer. The people of the capital whispered about the Wolf King returning from the grave. Some even called him Robb the Unbroken. Cersei summoned her Uncle Kevin and Sir Meryn Trant and Grand Maester Pycelle. They debated war, but Tywin was dead now, poisoned by his own blood. There was no mind like his left to guide the Lannister dynasty. The lion's roar had become a weak growl, and the wolves were gathering. Meanwhile, in the north, a storm was brewing. The Boltons still held Winterfell, backed by what remained of the Lannister alliance. Rose Bolton was dead, killed at the Red Wedding, but his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, was alive, cruel, and unpredictable. He had claimed his father's seat and styled himself Warden of the North, sending a message south to Robb. "Come and take it if you can." Robb read the letter in silence. Then with calm rage he said, "I will, and I'll hang your skin above the gates." But before he could march on Winterfell, another threat emerged. From the Vale came a whisper brought by a wandering knight. "Littlefinger is stirring." Petyr Baelish had married Lady Lisa Arryn and now held control of the Eyrie. He sent polite messages to Robb, full of compliments and vague promises of peace, but Robb knew better. Littlefinger was poison in silk robes. "We can't trust him," Catelyn said sharply. "He betrayed your father. He plays all sides." "I won't make allies of liars," Robb answered, "but I will keep my enemies closer than ever." Robb's vision for a new Westeros needed more than just swords. It needed alliances. So he turned to the unlikeliest of sources, the wildlings. He had heard of Jon Snow's rise at the Wall, of how he had brokered peace with Mance Rayder before the battle against the White Walkers. Robb sent a raven to Castle Black. "Brother, if you still live, come to me. The kingdom needs unity, not walls." It was the first letter Jon received since taking command of the Night's Watch. He read it with frozen hands. Robb Stark was alive, and not just alive. He was building a kingdom. Jon felt torn between duty and blood. But the North was changing. The Wall could no longer hold back what was coming. He made his decision. Within weeks, Jon Snow rode south under cover of night, abandoning his post. He arrived at River Run wearing black, but with a heart burning for purpose. When Robb saw him, the two brothers embraced like boys again. "You broke your vows," Robb whispered. "And you broke the world," John replied, half smiling. "Maybe we can rebuild it together." Robb introduced John to his council, and though some protested, Robb silenced them. "He is my blood," Robb said, "and blood must stand together now." With John came new eyes, new wisdom. He spoke of the White Walkers beyond the wall, of the dead rising, of ancient threats far worse than Lannisters or Boltons. At first many laughed, but not Robb. He listened, and that made all the difference. Robb began sending scouts north to investigate. He started gathering dragonglass from old records. He even considered sending an envoy to Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea. "If she lives," he said, "she may be the only one who understands fire and blood." But for now, his focus had to return to Winterfell. Ramsay Snow had been raiding villages, sending the heads of captured Stark loyalists back in boxes. His cruelty knew no limits. Talisa, now heavily pregnant, begged Robb to wait until spring. "I can't," he told her softly. "Every day I wait, more die. I have to end this." He kissed her belly. "When our child is born, they will have a real home, not a burned castle, not a memory, a kingdom." With Jon Snow at his side and thousands of new Riverland soldiers behind him, Robb began his march north. As the army moved, villages opened their doors. The banners of House Stark flew high once again. The people cried, "The king in the north rides to Winterfell!" And in the darkness of Winterfell, Ramsay watched with a twisted grin. "Let him come," he whispered to a girl he'd chained in the kennel. "Let him try." But Ramsay didn't know that Robb had changed. He wasn't coming as a prince hoping to reclaim a throne. He was coming as a conqueror, and he had no intention of leaving any Bolton alive. The march through the snow was slow and brutal. The north was colder than it had ever been. Robb Stark rode at the front, wrapped in heavy furs, grey wind padding silently beside him. At his side was Jon Snow, no longer just a brother of the Night's Watch, but his war council's most trusted voice. Every mile north felt like returning to a haunted dream. They passed abandoned farms where crows picked at corpses. Trees were charred, and blood stained the snow in frozen patches. Ramsay Bolton had turned the land into a graveyard, one house at a time. His cruelty wasn't just war, it was art. But Robb didn't waver. At every burned village, he stopped. He buried the dead. He let the people see him, not as a king, not even as a warrior, but as a Stark. They knelt before him in silence, some weeping, some simply whispering, "You came back." Hope, long frozen, began to thaw. Winterfell, however, loomed like a black wound in the distance. Ramsay had fortified it. The walls had been rebuilt with thick timber, and his banner, a flayed man on a pink field, mocked the north from the towers. Fires lit the battlements, traps filled the woods, and every night screams could be heard drifting from the castle. Ramsay made sure the north remembered who ruled them. Robb sent scouts ahead. A few returned, some didn't, but one brought a message. "He's got hostages," the scout said. "He's taken children of the bannermen. He's chained them in the kennels." Robb clenched his jaw. He didn't speak, but the next morning he ordered a raven sent to Winterfell with only 3 words. "Your end begins." Ramsay laughed when he read it. "He's grown bold," he said to his maester, who stood pale and silent in the corner. "Good. I want him to bring his wolves to my gate. I'll skin them all." But even Ramsay felt a chill when he looked into the woods. Something was watching, something older than war. It wasn't just Robb's army approaching, it was vengeance buried in the ice and snow, and Winterfell itself felt it stirring. The battle didn't begin with horns, it began with silence. Robb didn't launch a siege. He waited. He cut off the supply lines. He burned every outpost Ramsay sent. He circled the castle like a predator, and each day he took something: an outlying watchtower, a river crossing, a grain store. Every soldier Robb captured was given a choice: kneel and live, or stand and die. Most chose to kneel. Inside Winterfell, Ramsay grew paranoid. His hounds barked night and day. The shadows in the hall seemed to move. The snow outside the walls wasn't just snow. It felt like it had eyes. One night, the northern sky lit red with fire. Robb had burned the Bolton banners on the ridge. The flames could be seen for miles. "I am not here to reclaim," Robb said. To his men, "I am here to erase the name Bolton from the north." Then he called for Jon. Together they led the final assault. The battle for Winterfell wasn't clean. Ramsay had set traps, pits filled with sharpened stakes, boiling oil hidden. In the snow, archers waiting in the towers. The first wave of Robb's men were cut down like stalks of wheat. But Robb didn't stop. He rode into the storm himself, grey wind snarling at his side, his sword shining in the cold light. His armor bore the sigil of the new dynasty, the crowned direwolf, and behind him came men who had once lost everything and now had a king to believe in. Jon took the eastern wall with a band of wildlings who had followed him south. They scaled it under the cover of snow, moving like ghosts. The battle raged on the ramparts. Steel clashed, blood steamed in the cold air. Inside the castle, Ramsay waited in the hall, dragging one of the children forward, a knife to his throat. "Let him come," he muttered. "Let him see what mercy looks like here." But Robb had already entered from the north gate, cutting through the kennels. He found the bodies of prisoners, flayed and mutilated, and his silence turned deadly. He didn't storm the hall. He walked in. The doors burst open. Grey wind entered first, blooded and wild. Robb followed, snow steaming off his cloak, eyes locked on Ramsay. "Release the boy," he said. Ramsay smiled. "Or what?" Jon appeared from the shadows behind him. "Or you die slower than your father." Ramsay looked between them. He dropped the knife, and for the first time in his life he ran. He didn't get far. Robb didn't kill him quickly. He took Ramsay to the courtyard, where the north watched. And then he handed him to the people. It wasn't a clean death. It wasn't noble. But it was justice. Winterfell was reclaimed, not in glory, but in truth, in blood, in pain. When Robb stood before the heart tree in the godswood that night, he didn't pray. He made a vow. No more games. No more thrones of lies. This kingdom will rise not on tradition, but on fear of betrayal. He looked to Jon. "You said the dead are rising beyond the wall. So will we. Stronger, harsher, unforgiving." Jon said nothing. He only nodded. That night, Robb named Jon his hand, not his bannerman, not his counselor, his equal. "You're not my bastard brother anymore," he said. "You're part of the dynasty now." And Winterfell, cold, ancient, wounded, opened its gates to the future. But in the far north beyond the wall, something else had awakened, and it was watching the new king with dead eyes. The snow didn't stop falling, not even after the last. Of the Boltons were buried. The winds howled like ghosts, and the air grew colder than it had ever been. Winter had come. Not in words, but in truth. Robb Stark stood atop the ramparts of Winterfell, looking northward. The lands beyond the wall were hidden behind white skies and icy winds, but he could feel something stirring there. Not armies, not rebellion, something worse. Jon Snow stood beside him, dark and grim as ever. "You feel it too," Jon said quietly. Robb didn't respond at first. His gloved hands gripped the stone as snow gathered on his shoulders. "I've seen many things," Jon continued. "Whites, walkers, a king with blue eyes who doesn't speak, but commands death like a master of war." Robb's voice was low. "You saw him?" "I fought him and I lost." Silence passed between them. Robb turned. "Then it's time to fight again." But he knew he couldn't fight shadows with swords alone. His kingdom was still young, blood still wet in the snow, loyalty still uncertain. The river lords were rebuilding, the north remained fractured, and the Vale remained silent, watching. Still, Robb had no time to wait. He summoned a war council in the great hall of Winterfell. The lords gathered, Lord Manderley, Lady Barbary Dustin, the Blackfish, even Elyra Stark, once Frey, now a hardened presence among the northern elite. They looked to Robb, no longer just a Stark boy with a crown, but a man who had torn down old power with his own hands. "The north is ours," he began, "but the north is not enough." He looked around the room. A storm is coming from beyond. The wall. The kind of storm no king has faced. It does not want gold or castles. It wants everything warm, everything breathing. Dead. Most in the room scoffed. They hadn't seen the White Walkers. They hadn't felt the cold death pressing. On their bones, Jon stood. "I've seen them," he said. "You'll believe when they're at your gates, and by then it will be too late." The lords grew quiet. The Blackfish spoke first. "Then we march?" Robb shook his head. "No, not yet. First we prepare. We mine obsidian, we forge weapons, we train every man and woman who can stand. The north will be a wall, not just a kingdom." "And then?" Lady Dustin asked. "Then," Robb said coldly, "we burn the south." Gasps echoed through the hall. Robb stepped forward. "The Lannisters will not send aid. The Reach bows to gold. The Vale waits to pick the bones. And Dragonstone. Dragonstone belongs to a girl with dragons and no army. If we are to survive, they must kneel to us or be swept away." "Even the Targaryen?" asked Elyra, curious. "If she is wise," Robb said, "she will listen. If not, she will burn like the rest." Jon looked at him then. Really looked. There was steel in Robb's eyes that hadn't been there before. Vengeance had carved something colder inside him. Jon wondered how much of the boy who used to smile in the Godswood still remained. But the War Council agreed. Messengers were sent, ravens took flight, and the preparations for war began again. In the crypts below Winterfell, Robb walked alone. He passed the stone statues of his ancestors, old kings with swords across their laps. He passed his father, Ned, his mother's empty alcove, and the tombs of Bran and Rickon, though neither body had ever been returned. He stopped in front of the newest grave, one carved only weeks ago, Rose Bolton, betrayer, usurper, flayed. By fire then, another beside it, Ramsay Snow, Hound's Feast. Robb stared at the stones and whispered, "Is this what it means to rule? To bury more than you save?" Behind him the wind rustled. He thought it was his mind, until he heard it again. A whisper, low and broken. "Winter is not your war." He spun around, hand on his sword. No one. Only the dark. Only the dead. He left the crypts, shaken. That night he did not sleep. Far beyond the wall, the Night King stood silently atop a frozen ridge. Below him, a massive army gathered. Thousands of wights, fallen wildlings, and others too ancient to name. At his side stood a creature unlike the rest, a giant of blue flesh and ice-black armor, once a first man, now twisted by dark magic. The Night King pointed south. The dead began to march. Back in Winterfell, Talisa gave birth. It was a difficult labor. The Maester feared the child would not live, but as the sun rose through the storm, the boy cried out, loud and strong. Robb stood at his wife's side, cradling the boy. His hands trembled. "A name, your grace?" the Maester asked. Robb looked down at the child, his dark hair, his quiet, fierce eyes. "Eddard," he whispered. "Eddard Stark, the first of the new blood." He looked at Talisa, pale and tired but smiling, and then to Jon. "Swear to me," Robb said. "If I fall, you protect him." Jon nodded without hesitation. I swear it." Robb kissed his son's forehead. "Then let the old world end." And so it would. In the weeks that followed, snow thickened across Westeros. Ravens stopped returning. Villages vanished without a trace. And on the wind, people began to hear things. Not screams, not songs, but silence. A silence colder than death. And Robb Stark, High King of a broken realm, stood ready to meet it. The snow never stopped. By the time the first White Walker stepped across the shattered remnants of the wall, the north was a fortress of frozen steel. Every man, woman and child in Robb Stark's kingdom had been trained to fight. Blacksmiths forged weapons from dragonglass, hauled from long-forgotten caves near the western coast. Fires burned day and night in every watchtower, and scouts rode until their horses died beneath them. Still, it wasn't enough. Atop Winterfell's ramparts, Robb watched the horizon. Jon Snow stood beside him, a direwolf cloak draped over his shoulders, long claw at his hip. Below them the army waited, 15,000 strong. Wildlings, Northmen, riverlords, even knights from the Vale who had abandoned Littlefingers. Slippery promises and answered the call of something real. But when the dead came, they came like a wave. It started with a storm, black clouds spinning across the sky, blotting out the sun. Then the cold grew sharper, not just winter cold, but death cold. Bones aching, soul-numbing, time-freezing cold, and then the silence. No war horn, no screech, just thousands of dead eyes, blue and empty, appearing through the mist. The battle of Winterfell began with no warning. The first line of men vanished within minutes. Screams were swallowed by the snow. Arrows didn't matter. Fire slowed them, but only for a breath. Robb led the second wave himself, riding with grey wind into the chaos. The direwolf tore through corpses with bloody fangs while Robb cut with ice-forged steel, his sword glowing with faint red veins of obsidian. But even the strongest began to fall. For every dead thing they destroyed, 5 more came crawling from the dark. Whites climbed the walls, poured into the courtyards, smashed through the gates like a living tide. And above it all, the Night King rode a dead wyvern made of bone and ice. He didn't scream, he didn't strike, he only watched. Inside the grate, Hall Talisa held baby Eddard close, wrapped in furs. The castle shook with war. Servants cried, maesters ran, but Talisa remained still, eyes fixed on the snow-covered door, a dagger in her hand. She would not die on her knees. Elyra Stark stood beside her, no longer the shy Frey girl who once passed a note across a feast table. She held a sword now, and her eyes burned with fury. "Whatever comes through that door," she said softly, "we do not run." Outside, the dead began to climb the inner wall. On the ramparts, Jon Snow came face to face with a White Walker. Its blade met Longclaw in a clash that cracked the stone beneath them. It moved fast, too fast. It knocked Jon to the ground and raised its sword high. Then came a flash of grey. Ghost, Jon's direwolf, leapt into the air and dragged the creature down. They both disappeared over the side of the wall in silence. Jon rose, bloodied, heart pounding. Enough! He found Robb near the Godswood, fighting hand to hand now, surrounded by fallen men and shattered shields. "They're inside," Jon yelled. "We're losing the walls." Robb looked past him, into the mist. Not yet. Then they saw it. Horn in the east, fire wings, a dragon, Daenerys. Targaryen had come, her dragon, Drogon, swept through the skies, flames roaring across the battlefield. Behind her rode what remained of her unsullied and Dothraki, thinned by her own war for the throne. She had ignored Robb's raven at first. She wanted to be queen alone, but then she saw the dead rise in the Stormlands, devouring entire towns. Her pride burned away, and now she came, not for a crown, but to survive. The tide turned, fire cleansed the courtyards. Obsidian spears rained down from the towers, the dead burned. And yet, the Night King still stood. Robb turned to Jon. This ends now. Jon nodded. Together, they stormed into the heart of Winterfell. The Night King waited by the heart tree in the godswood, his wyvern curled beside him like a frozen statue. As Jon and Robb approached, he raised a hand, and the ground cracked open. Whites clawed from the dirt, ancient and rotten. Robb charged anyway. Jon followed. The battle was brutal. One by one, the whites fell, only to be replaced by more. Then the Night King joined, faster than shadow, stronger than steel. He cut through 3 men like paper. Jon duelled him with Longclaw, sparks flying. Robb struck from the side, drawing. Blood, if it could be called that. But the Night King was not meant to fall to steel. He stabbed Jon in the side and threw Robb across the clearing. He raised his blade, then a whisper came on the wind, a face in the heart tree, a voice only Robb could hear. Not steel, not fire, blood. Robb rose. Blood pouring from his mouth. He looked at Jon, then at his sword, then he understood. With a final scream, Robb leapt forward, plunging the dragonglass blade into his own chest, right as he wrapped his arms around the Night King and dragged him into the heart tree. The tree exploded in white fire. The Night King screamed for the first and last time, and all across the battlefield the dead fell. Winterfell burned, bodies everywhere. Ash in the air, but the sky was clear. Jon found Robb's body beneath the heart tree, unmoving, pale. He fell to his knees. Talisa arrived, carrying baby Eddard in her arms, tears frozen on her cheeks. "He bought us time," Jon said quietly. "No," Talisa whispered. "He bought us a future." Robb Stark was buried beneath the heart tree, not as a king, not as a lord, but as the man who stopped death itself. His dynasty lived on, through his son, through the people who rose after him, through Jon Snow, who now carried the burden of leadership, not as a Targaryen, not as a bastard, but as the last Stark of Winterfell still breathing. And as the spring sun finally broke through the clouds, melting the snow off the walls, the North whispered a new name, Robb the Redeemer, not a king, a legend, a dynasty not written in gold but in sacrifice. And Westeros would never forget.